Hey guys, tonight we start with a man in robes standing in a field under a bruised purple sky. He doesn't move much, just shifts his weight slightly and drags a stick through the dirt slowly, deliberately, as if he's tracing something far bigger than a simple line. The breeze is quiet, the stars are beginning to blink awake, and nearby, a candle sputters beside a leather-bound book with no title, just a weathered clasp. The only sound? The scratch of the stick against soil, and maybe your own breath. Now, before we go any deeper, here's a quick reality check. You probably wouldn't survive this monastery. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's boring. No phones, no memes, no Wi-Fi. Just centuries of dust, dense theology, and a diet best described as root-based. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me your city and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing who else is up late, chasing strange history. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You kneel quietly at the edge of the field, the monk's silhouette just ahead. His name isn't famous, at least not widely. In some old monastic ledgers, he's listed as Brother Alaric. In others, merely the one who drew stars. But over time, the legend formed around a simple image, a monk with a walking stick sketching heaven into the earth like it owed him answers. He doesn't speak much. In fact, the other monks whisper that he's taken a vow of selective silence. Not a real vow technically, but he insists that words muddy what the sky tries to say. So instead he watches, observes, and then draws. Most evenings, you see him pacing slowly in the meadow behind the abbey. It's a strange sight, barefoot in the cold, dragging that stick like a cartographer who's lost his map. He'll pause, look upward for a long moment, then squat and scratch a pattern of lines, dots, and arcs that look almost accidental. Until you step back. Then it begins to resemble something, a constellation, a circle of motion, a spiral you can't quite understand, but can't stop staring at either. One mainstream fact about medieval monasteries, they were centers of knowledge. Not just religious devotion, but astronomy, medicine, music, and weird fringe theories. Monks copied texts for hours each day by candlelight and on an empty stomach. They were the Wikipedia of their time if Wikipedia smelled like onions and boiled cabbage. But Brother Alaric, he wasn't satisfied with copying. He wanted to see. Some said he was trying to map the stars. Others claimed he was hunting for the geometry of paradise itself. And once, after a particularly long evening, someone joked that he was just bored and using the dirt like monks used parchment out of habit. But it wasn't habit, it was obsession. You remember one night clearly. The stars were particularly sharp, as if someone had wiped the sky clean. Alaric had gathered 3 sticks and a piece of twine and arranged them in a triangle. Not just any triangle, an equilateral one perfectly spaced. He positioned it just right, aimed it at the moon's arc, and whispered something you couldn't quite hear. Then he marked the moon's position on the ground, and the moment it shifted, he adjusted the triangle. Again, and again. Was he measuring time orbit, the tilt of something metaphysical? Nobody knew. He never explained. The quirky detail that always stuck with you. He refused to use ink, said it was too proud, preferred ash, chalk, and dirt, materials that would fade, that could be erased by wind or careless boot. If it matters, he once muttered, the stars will draw it again. Historians still argue whether Alaric ever intended his diagrams to be permanent. Some believe he was conducting celestial observations ahead of his time, early stabs at astrolabes and orreries. Others argue he was chasing something far less scientific, a divine pattern, a God grid woven into creation. And some predictably claim he was just deeply sleep-deprived and mildly unhinged. You saw the way he paused before every line, as if listening to the soil, He never drew during storms, only on clear nights. The sky must speak, he said, once staring at the horizon like it had just coughed. And while most monks stuck to their candlelit scrolls inside the cloister, Alaric stayed outside through wind, through frost, through the whispers that he was losing his mind. But even the skeptics, the ones who joked behind his back, couldn't deny the strange power in his sketches. Spirals that matched lunar cycles, grids that aligned with solstice shadows, circles that mirrored cathedral domes. He once drew a full diagram stretching 20 feet across the back garden, only to wipe it clean with his sleeve the moment it was finished. Too close, he muttered, and walked away. You still remember that shape, a 7-pointed star nested in a circle surrounded by tiny symbols that didn't match any known language. Some resembled musical notes. Others looked like tiny footprints. One looked absurdly like a spoon. Whatever he was mapping, it wasn't just astronomy. It was memory, heaven, or something in between. You lie back now on the damp grass where he once worked and let your eyes trace the stars above, trying to see what he saw. And maybe, just maybe, you catch a flicker of the pattern he tried to share with that stubborn stick in his calloused hand. You return to the field the next night hoping to catch him again. There's a comfort now in the familiar rhythm. The way Brother Alaric kneels, stands, steps to the side, then leans in close with his stick as if the earth is whispering back. Tonight, the candle burns lower, the wind quieter, and the moon slightly fuller. He doesn't acknowledge you, but you know he sees you. He always does. There's a faint grid left over from last night. Faint lines scuffed by wind and boots, but the shape is still there. A memory in the mud. He's building again, layering new marks over old, connecting the dots like a child playing Connect the Stars, except what he draws has no known shape. It's not a map, it's a question. This is where the dream begins to expand. He stops mid-stroke and tilts his head. Then, in the dirt beside his main figure, he draws a smaller circle, concentric, careful. He adds lines like spokes of a wheel, then steps back to squint at the sky. You follow his gaze. He's not just watching the stars now. He's following them, tracking their arcs, as if they're dancers in a routine only he remembers. Back inside the monastery, you once peeked into his tiny cell. One narrow cot, one shelf of books, and a single candle melted into the skull of a saint. Don't ask how he got that. On the wall lines, not drawn in ink, but etched into the stone with a nail. Diagrams, angles, circles within circles. They looked almost like early star charts if those charts also told stories. That's the thing about Alaric. His maps weren't just diagrams. They felt alive. There's a word he mutters sometimes, colum. Latin for heaven, but not just the sky. The ordered firmament, the realm where divine intelligence lives. To him, the stars weren't just lights. They were messages. Notes in a cosmic hymn only partially heard. You remember the first time he said it aloud, standing in the refectory holding a scrap of bark. If heaven is measured, he whispered, it must leave marks in the soil. Then he sat down and refused to elaborate. The monks stared. One rolled his eyes. Another made the sign of the cross. But the idea stuck with you. So did the patterns. He began subtly drawing in different parts of the grounds behind the library and the herb garden, even once in the cloister walkway, always when no one else was watching. Always with that same stick. Sometimes he used pebbles to mark intersections or carved symbols into bark. One tree near the chapel had an entire spiral etched into its trunk. No one noticed until the abbot leaned against it and got a splinter shaped like a crescent moon. That night, Alaric drew in 3 directions, each line pointing to a chapel window. At noon the next day, sunlight pierced those windows in perfect sequence, illuminating a single tile at the altar. One, the color of copper. Coincidence. Historians still argue whether monks like Alaric had access to ancient solar tracking methods you recall reading once in the Abbey's oldest scrolls, or whether some simply intuited their patterns by sheer observation and divine obsession. Take your pick. Either he was brilliant or just had a very long attention span, and then came the dirt map. The big one. You remember it like it was yesterday. He spent 3 days clearing a section of the field. Removed rocks, raked it flat, even roped it off with herbs, sweet-smelling ones like sage and lavender. It smelled like a sacred bakery. And then, inch by inch, he began. He didn't stop for meals. Barely slept. Drew from memory and moonlight. It started as a simple spiral, then doubled, then multiplied. Soon it looked like a mandala sacred geometry, etched in loam. He added markers, little piles of crushed shell flecks of coal, and even one tiny feather tied to a stick. You asked him what it meant. He just smiled, tapped his stick twice, and said, "It's not where we are, it's where we're going." Cryptic. Maddening. Possibly genius. A quirky detail you later learned monks sometimes used the patterns in their prayer walks to meditate. Spirals, labyrinths, circles all mapped onto gardens and courtyards. But no one had ever made a prayer walk that looked like this. Alaric's pattern was too big, too strange. It didn't loop back. It radiated outward like a celestial diagram with no center. The abbot came to inspect it, of course, stepped around it awkwardly, arms folded, then sighed. "This isn't theology," he grumbled. "This is doodling with extra steps." But even he didn't have the heart to erase it. That night you watched from the shadows as Alaric stood in the middle, turned slowly on the spot, then knelt and drew one last circle, a tiny one, right where he stood. Then he lay down in the dirt and closed his eyes, arms crossed like a saint in a tomb. You thought he'd fallen asleep, but later you found a line etched beside that final circle. "Here begins the ladder." Was it metaphor madness? Some lost monastic math puzzle? You still don't know, but sometimes when you close your eyes, you can see the pattern again. The way the dirt held his thoughts, the way the wind barely dared to blow them away, and the quiet voice in your head whispers, "Start with a circle, then ask it questions." You return to the monastery courtyard just as the sun tilts toward evening, casting long golden rectangles through the cloister's arched windows. Brother Alaric is already out there barefoot again, stick in hand, quietly poking a series of intersecting circles into the chalk-covered flagstones. His robes are dusted with ash, and his hair looks like it hasn't negotiated with a comb in days. There's a look in his eye that says, he's not here for conversation. He's here for revelation. The other monks pass him by like he's a particularly inconvenient statue. Some nod politely. Others pretend they didn't see him. One or two whisper, still with the circles, and sigh into their psalm books. You get the sense that everyone's trying very hard not to admit they're curious. But you stop and watch. He's moved beyond dirt now. He's working on stone, using a mixture of crushed eggshell and white lime to create precise chalk lines that snake across the courtyard. The shape emerging under his hand looks oddly like a compass rose, except the spokes don't match north-south directions. They're tilted a few degrees off. Not random, just askew, intentional. Like the angles themselves are pointing to something you can't yet see. You edge closer. He glances at you, but says nothing. Then slowly, with all the gravitas of a man about to unveil an ancient truth, he draws a line between two outer rings of the diagram and whispers, "This is how light walks." Okay, not the clearest explanation, but he seems satisfied. You learn later that he's been reading, rereading, a series of ancient texts in the monastery library. Texts that include treatises on sacred geometry, Platonic solids, and yes, astronomical commentaries by early Christian thinkers. Some of the passages are standard sun and moon cycles, biblical timelines. Others are fringe, like the one that suggested Eden itself was arranged in concentric circles, and that heaven could be mapped using divine mathematics. That one he underlined so hard the ink bled through. You remember flipping through one of those books after he left it unattended? In the margins, he'd scribbled thoughts in a tight crabbed script God builds with circles. Stars do not wander. They return. What if the firmament is folded? That stuck with you. Later that week, he starts laying out string across the courtyard. Long pieces tied between pillars forming a web of triangles. He plucks them like harp strings, listening for tension. When a gust of wind makes one hum, he smiles and says, "See, it sings when it aligns." You don't know if he's joking. You don't think he knows if he's joking. Here's your mainstream historical fact in the medieval world: the harmony of the spheres. The idea that celestial bodies produced a form of music by their motion was taken seriously by scholars and monks alike. The concept came from ancient Greek philosophy and was absorbed into Christian theology. The stars didn't just shine, they sang if you knew how to listen. So maybe Alaric wasn't so fringe after all. Or maybe he was. One afternoon, you find him standing before the cathedral door, tracing the stone arch with his stick, slowly, reverently. Then he begins measuring the shadows cast by the sun through the stained glass windows. You swear he marks where each colored beam lands as the sun shifts, using pebbles and petals to trace their passage across the floor. He turns to you and murmurs, "This building was made to remember heaven." Then, in case you were wondering if he'd lost the thread of reality altogether, he adds, "But even memory fades if not refreshed." You notice something else that day. He's wearing a small leather pouch around his neck now, and inside it, not relics, not scripture, but a tiny folded square of parchment, covered in circles and radiating lines annotated with dots and Latin notations. It's a map, or maybe a prayer, possibly both. That night after the monks have eaten and the halls have gone quiet, you follow him to the scriptorium. It's locked technically, but you suspect Alaric picked the lock with a hairpin or a parable. He moves through the shelves like a ghost, pulling one dusty scroll after another. He lays them out on a reading desk, overlapping them like layers of skin. Each one bears maps, not just geographic, but cosmological. Diagrams of heaven, earth, and everything in between. Stars with names, circles within circles, angels drawn as fiery wheels. He holds up a candle and gestures you closer. And then he shows you something, a figure from a 9th century manuscript. It looks like a man inside a circle, arms outstretched, surrounded by orbiting stars and Hebrew letters. The caption beneath reads Homo Caelestis, heavenly man. He taps the figure's head. This, he says, is what we're inside. It's not until much later that you learn some monks believed heaven itself was shaped like a human body, that the structure of the cosmos mirrored the structure of the soul. Head above, heart in the middle, feet touching earth, the macrocosm and microcosm intertwined. Historians still argue whether diagrams like these were literal beliefs or spiritual metaphors. But Alaric, he didn't draw lines between the two. To him, everything was a diagram. If it could be seen, it could be mapped. If it could be mapped, it could be measured. And if it could be measured, well then maybe God had left breadcrumbs after all. You return to your own cot that night and lie awake, staring at the stone ceiling. You can almost see the circles now spinning slowly above you, like celestial gears. And just before sleep takes you, you whisper into the darkness. What if he's right? It's not long before the monastery begins to shift around him. The lines in the courtyard stay longer. The circles creep closer to the chapel walls. And Brother Alaric once the quiet monk who murmured to stars and scraped diagrams into dirt, is now being discussed in murmurs that ripple down the corridors like wind through reeds. It starts with a broken broom. Someone finds it leaning against the cloister fountain, snapped in half, but not by accident. One monk claims he saw Brother Alaric using it to sketch a massive symbol into the dust near the relic chamber. When confronted, Alaric just said, the angles were wrong. It needed to break. And that doesn't go over well. Because here's the thing. Monasteries are machines. Quiet, slow machines made of prayer and rhythm. Every monk is a cog, every bell a gear. And Alaric. He's starting to feel like sand in the mechanism. One morning, he doesn't show up to matins. Instead, he's in the cloister garden, kneeling beside the sundial, whispering to it like it's a confused child. Another day, he rearranges the pews in the chapel slightly off-center so that the light lands more honestly on the altar. No one asks what that means, but no one forgets it either. By now, everyone has a Brother Alaric theory. Some say he's trying to summon angels. Others suspect he's building some heretical zodiac. One even suggests he's possessed, though. That monk, to be fair, blames demonic influence for everything from spoiled barley to stubbed toes. You overhear the abbot sigh to the prior one evening. He's either a visionary or a liability, possibly both. And it's not said with anger. It's said with the weary tone of someone who's seen too many prophets grow too fond of their own revelations. Here's a mainstream fact to keep in your pocket during the Middle Ages' unorthodox theological experimentation, especially when tied to celestial symbols, could be seen as dangerous. The Church tolerated study of the stars if it led to deeper faith. But if it started sounding like astrology, or worse, gnosis, that could tip into heresy real fast. The difference between a holy diagram and a forbidden sigil was often just context. And Brother Alaric was increasingly out of context. His selective silence had also shifted. Now he spoke, but only in fragments. Heaven curves inward. Light doesn't cast shadows in paradise. The sun is not alone. And once, while peeling turnips for supper, he said, the Garden of Eden was spherical. That's why it's missing. Quirky, yes. Harmless mostly, but unsettling definitely. One afternoon, while gathering herbs with the infirmary brothers, you stumble across something unusual near the edge of the orchard. A perfect hexagon pressed into the grass. 6 pegs mark the points. Thin strands of reed twine connect them. In the center, a flat stone with a spiral carved shallowly into it. You call for Alaric. He appears almost instantly, like he'd been waiting. Don't touch it, he says. It's measuring breath. You do not ask what that means. You learn later that he's been carving small symbols into the back of hymnals, tiny circles, triangles, little sunbursts that look more alchemical than musical. One monk reports that Alaric replaced the word glory with gravity in a hymn transcription. When asked, he just nodded and said, same thing. Historians still debate whether monks like Alaric were early scientists cloaked in robes or mystics who used mathematics like incense. In his case, it's hard to tell. He reads Ptolemy and Augustine with equal reverence. He quotes Ezekiel one moment and ancient Roman engineering texts the next. Once he said the stars were God's punctuation marks, which would be poetic if it weren't followed by him chalking Latin glyphs onto the ceiling beams. The community begins to divide quietly. Some are intrigued. They sneak peeks at his diagrams, trace his patterns with bare feet when no one's looking. One novice even starts leaving breadcrumbs beside Alaric's latest circles, hoping for some kind of mystical sign. Nothing happens unless you count the crows. Others are nervous. They stop inviting him to group readings. They begin locking the scroll cabinets. One brother insists the celestial diagrams have started appearing in his dreams. He looks haunted, but also vaguely delighted. You You're caught in the middle, torn between admiration and unease. Because here's the unsettling part, some of the patterns work. One morning, Alaric points to the sky before sunrise and says, "The moon will touch the spire's shadow before the bell." And it does. Precisely, like the whole abbey had momentarily become a clock, and he was reading its hands with perfect clarity. That day, someone leaves a note on his cot. No name, just 2 words draw less. He ignores it. Instead, he begins chalking a new pattern right in the refectory, a large circle with intersecting arcs and a dot in the center. When the abbot demands an explanation, Alaric simply gestures and says, "This is where the bread remembers." That's not the last straw, but it's definitely a straw. From that day on, Alaric is quietly monitored, assigned more manual labor, fewer books, fewer opportunities to wander. His tools, the stick, the chalk, the strings, start disappearing. No one admits taking them. No one needs to. But he finds others. He sharpens a beetroot to a point and draws with it on the garden stones. Uses spilled candle wax for compass arcs. Even his own footprints become lines in the mud. The more the monastery restricts him, the more creative his methods become, until one day he disappears. No goodbye, no final diagram. Just his sandals left beside the old sundial and a spiral traced in dew. No one knows where he went, but that night the clouds clear suddenly after days of gloom, and for a brief moment, the stars shine unusually bright. You lie awake in your cot, staring out the narrow window, half expecting to see him standing on the chapel roof, drawing circles in the air with a finger made of moonlight. You don't see Brother Alaric for 3 days. Which wouldn't be so strange. Monks often take retreats, disappear into the hills for fasting or solitude. But this feels different. There's no official word. Just an empty cot, undisturbed meals, and his sandals still perfectly aligned beside the sundial, as if he stepped out of them and evaporated into geometry. By the 4th day, the whispers begin. Some say he's had a vision and gone to seek confirmation in the forest. Others say he's fled because the abbot was planning to summon outside church officials, an ecclesiastical audit, so to speak. One young novice claims he saw Alaric walking across the lake at sunrise, not around it, across, which seems unlikely. But then again, you've watched him predict shadows down to the heartbeat. Curiosity wins. You gather a few trusted friends and decide to check the one place no one else dares, the library's restricted section. Monastic libraries are strange places, smelling of dust, old leather, and nervous reverence. The restricted section, also known as the not yet condemned collection, isn't exactly secret, but it's heavily discouraged. And the latch always seems to stick just long enough to make you question whether the door really wants to open. But open it does. Inside, you find scrolls wrapped in cracked linen books, bound with horn, and one shelf labeled simply Misc. Cosmologies. You can already smell the footnotes. You light a candle, careful not to drip wax on anything that looks even remotely Latin, and begin to flip through the chaos. Celestial atlases, angel charts, star maps shaped like trees. A few are in Greek, one appears to be in code, and one, your favorite, is just an angry letter from a monk in Prague complaining about unholy triangles. And then you find it. A thin folio, no title, but inside diagrams, familiar ones, Alaric's. Or rather, ones he copied, or rediscovered. It's hard to tell. The drawings match his courtyard spirals. There's even one with his signature twist, 3 circles, joined not at their centers, but at a point just shy of alignment. It's labeled in Latin aurea ambiguitas, golden uncertainty. You copy it by candlelight, your hand trembling slightly, and slip it into your sleeve. Back in your cell, you can't sleep. Your fingers trace the diagram again and again. You find yourself whispering its angles like prayers. Not because you understand it, but because something about it feels inevitable. The next day, Alaric returns. Just walks through the cloister gate like he's been on an afternoon stroll. His hair's a mess, his robes are damp, and his left foot is stained green. But he looks calmer, sharper, like someone who's solved a riddle and doesn't feel the need to explain it. He eats in silence, then naps in the sun like a cat. By Vespers, he's back in the garden carving something new into the dirt. You watch from a distance. It's different this time. Not circles, not spirals, but a shape that looks like a cross inside a triangle inside a square. A diagram you've only seen in alchemical texts, the philosopher's map. A symbol for the union of opposites, heaven and earth, soul and flesh. He doesn't look up as you approach, just says they're not separate, never were. He hands you a scrap of bark, written in charcoal. The soul is a compass. Mainstream fact, some monastic thinkers during the 12th and 13th centuries did believe geometry was a divine language, not metaphorically, literally. God created the world with number and shape, and those who studied it, really studied it, weren't just scholars. They were seekers, pilgrims of pattern, fringe tidbit. Some believed certain symbols drawn with the correct proportions could open spiritual perception. Not magic, not sorcery, just vision. Sacred alignment. Alaric never claimed this directly, but his diagrams always had one thing in common. They felt like doors. Historians still argue whether monks like Alaric were proto-scientists, mystics, or just very bored and very brilliant. But standing beside him now, watching him press a triangle into the dirt with 2 fingers and a whisper, you wonder if maybe those categories miss the point, because suddenly you see it. Not all of it. Not clearly. But enough. The triangle connects to the spiral. The spiral reflects the chapel layout. The chapel aligns with the solstice shadow. The solstice shadow falls on the map you copied from the library. And that map, its center overlaps the courtyard, drain the one no one ever thinks about. You run to it, kneel beside the stone grate, and peer down. Water trickles below, but etched faintly into the stone lip around it. Circles, small ones, like a forgotten diagram, and at the center, just visible in the gloom, a shape like the one Alaric drew yesterday. You scramble back to tell him, but he's already there. Some doors, he says, were never meant to open with keys. You don't know what that means, but the sky feels closer. That night you dream of stars falling upward. By the following week, the courtyard has become a cathedral of chalk. Every stone bears a mark, some small as a coin, others as long as your forearm. Arcs cross paths with lines. Dots connect into constellations. You tiptoe through it like it's holy ground, afraid to break the pattern. And yet, it never feels finished. Alaric is always adding, shifting, wiping away. Today he's quiet, more than usual. You find him inside the actual cathedral, kneeling on the cold flagstones near the altar. There's no service, no candles lit, just that slow hush that cathedrals carry even when empty. His fingers move across the floor like they're reading Braille in the dust. He draws a circle, then another inside it, and then he leans forward and begins to whisper. Not to you, not to anyone, just to the stone. This has become his new ritual. Not content to mark the garden, he's begun charting the inside of the church itself. At first, it was just chalk lines between the windows, small symbols behind the pews. But now he's mapping the very layout, aisles, columns, shadows, as if it's all part of some divine diagram waiting to be revealed. You watch as he moves deliberately toward the central dome, where the light filters down from a high stained glass oculus. He stands beneath it, closes his eyes, and waits. A shaft of gold spills onto his shoulders. He opens his arms. This is the center, he murmurs, not of the church, of the pattern. You want to say something, but honestly, what could you say? Mainstream historical fact, medieval cathedral builders often aligned their structures with celestial events, equinox, light solstice, sunrise, even lunar reflections. The idea that sacred geometry shaped sacred space wasn't just decorative, it was theological. Cathedrals weren't just buildings, they were metaphysical machines. Alaric seems to think so too. He chalks a wide circle around the central pillar, marking angles every 15 degrees. Hours, he explains, but not of the day, of the turning. He draws a spiral out from it, connecting one point to a side chapel another, to the baptismal font. He hesitates at the third, then scratches out a line and redraws it 6 inches to the left. You see him pause and blink hard. His hand trembles. Too wide, he mutters. It breaks the ratio. Quirky detail. He's now using a broken stained glass shard as his drawing tool. Says it gives him truer lines. You're not sure if that means precision or just drama. Possibly both. He's interrupted once Brother Leon stepping cautiously into the nave. He watches for a moment, then clears his throat. Is this prayer? Brother Alaric looks up. There's a long silence. Then he smiles and says, closer to confession. Leon doesn't respond. He backs away slowly, as if afraid the lines might leap from the floor and wrap around his ankles. That night, the monks gather for evening prayer. But instead of kneeling in rows, they hesitate. The lines Alaric has drawn snake through the pews across the altar, steps up to the choir loft. There's no clear path anymore, only pattern. The abbot makes a decision. He doesn't forbid Alaric outright. Instead, he quietly announces a cleansing of the nave. Fresh stones, new scrubbing, no chalk allowed within the cathedral walls. It's said gently, like a parent explaining bedtime, but the message is clear. Alaric listens, nods, and offers no resistance. Then, the next morning, he shows up in the cloister walk, with flower petals. Yes, petals. He's now marking his diagrams with trails of saffron crushed. Violet, even dried rosemary. One spiral smells like a spice rack. Another resembles a labyrinth made of spring blossoms. A few monks pretend to sneeze in protest, but no one steps on them. You ask him why flowers? He shrugs. They die like ideas, but they bloom again. You wonder if that's defiance or doctrine. Historians still argue whether this sort of behavior was tolerated in the early church. Some abbots embraced experimental devotion, especially if it didn't directly challenge dogma. Others, not so much. One famous case from the 11th century involved a monk who tried to write the entire book of Revelation in spiral form. His manuscript was confiscated, but copies mysteriously resurfaced in 4 other monasteries. The same week Alaric switches to petals, something else changes. Visitors begin arriving. Not many at first. A few curious scribes from a neighboring abbey, a local bishop's clerk, a merchant whose wife dreamed of a man with chalk for hands. They don't ask for sermons. They ask for silence. And they walk through Alaric's patterns as if touring a gallery of quiet wonders. Some kneel. One weeps. A child tries to trace the lines with a reed. Alaric says little. He only watches. Sometimes he adjusts a pattern mid-visit. Other times, he seems to wait as if seeing how people interact with the space changes the space itself. He begins lighting small candles at night. Just a few. Placed at key intersections. When the wind doesn't snuff them out, they glow like stars on a black marble sky. You watch from the dormitory window and feel something stir. Something that feels like reverence. And maybe something else. Because here's the truth that nobody wants to admit it's working. You feel calmer, sharper, When you walk the spirals, your thoughts slow. When you sit at the junction of the rose-shaped diagram by the chapel door, your prayers feel less mechanical. Even the sternest monks find themselves pausing longer in the cloister, like something is tuning the air. And through it all, Alaric continues, measuring by moonlight, mapping light, listening for the moment when geometry hums. You wonder if the church had let him draw on the ceiling, would he have mapped heaven itself? Maybe he still will. A low fog settles across the abbey grounds the next morning, softening everything it touches: the trees, the stones, even the sharp lines of Brother Alaric's latest pattern in the cloister. You step out into the haze and nearly trip over a bundle of lavender he's arranged in the shape of a triangle. He's nearby, of course, kneeling barefoot in the dew with chalk dust on his elbows and flower pollen in his beard. You don't even ask anymore. You just watch. Today's diagram is different again. Less math, more mood. It curves in gentle loops like a spiral trying to remember how to be a circle. There's a rhythm to it, a slowness that matches the hush of the fog. He calls it a lullaby for stone. Before you can ask what that means, the gate bell rings. Visitors. Again. By now, it's becoming a pattern of its own. They arrive in 2s and 3s wrapped in travel cloaks, boots still damp from the road. They don't come for relics. They come for the monk with the chalk. Word has spread first through neighboring parishes, then whispers through market stalls, then letters carried by falconers and footmen alike. And now the curious have come. You stand near the cloister arch and watch as they filter in: a knight limping from an old wound, a noblewoman with ink-stained hands, 2 children clutching a single bread loaf, a young friar carrying a harp. They don't speak loudly. They walk slowly, reverently, like they've entered something sacred, but not quite explainable. One of the monks leans over and grumbles, "This isn't a church anymore. It's a circus in sandals." You pretend not to hear him, because the visitors, they're not mocking. They're listening. Alaric greets no one. He just draws. He's begun working on a massive design, now stretching the entire length of the outer cloister walk, a long path that loops and curves and folds back on itself, but never repeats. You step onto it, follow it, and realize it's not a path to somewhere. It's a path through something internal. Mainstream historical fact: labyrinths in medieval cathedrals were often walked as symbolic pilgrimages. You couldn't reach the Holy Land walk the labyrinth. You couldn't afford indulgences. Walk the labyrinth. It was a journey without leaving. A map of inner devotion. Alaric's pattern feels like that, but with more angles. A bishop arrives later that day, not dressed to intimidate, just in dark robes, his mitre tucked under one arm. He watches the visitors with unreadable eyes, then sits beside Alaric's spiral for nearly an hour before rising and murmuring, "I'll report that the spirit still breathes here. It's the closest thing to approval you'll ever hear." But the real shift comes later that week, when peasants begin arriving. They don't bring letters. They bring questions, quiet ones. "My daughter doesn't speak. Should I walk the spiral with her? Can I pray at the triangle for a good harvest? Will the stars move if I kneel at that stone?" And Alaric, God help him, begins answering, not in riddles, not in geometry, but in gestures. He guides them to places in the pattern, hands them chalk, shows them how to trace a circle, or sit where the wind lines up with the northern arch. He teaches by doing, not telling. And somehow it works. You see a young man cry just from walking the spiral barefoot. A woman falls asleep at the diagram's center and wakes saying, "I saw my mother." Even the birds are quieter. One monk whispers, "He's turning this place into a shrine." Another replies, "Then maybe it was always meant to be one." Still, not all are pleased. A senior brother frowns at the visitors. They bring noise, and dirt, and superstition, but the abbot remarkably says nothing, because something has shifted in him too. You notice him once alone in the early morning fog, walking the petal trail from the chapel to the herb garden. He thinks no one sees, but Alaric does. And when they pass each other, they share a nod that feels like a treaty. Quirky tidbit. One of the nobles who visits leaves behind a box of lapis-dyed chalks. Alaric uses them to trace a new design near the well blue and gold lines shaped like ripples on water. When asked what it's for, he simply says, reflection. The children, of course, love it. They run through it giggling arms wide like birds. And Alaric, he lets them. Doesn't correct them. Doesn't worry they're stepping in the wrong places. Maybe because he knows play is another kind of prayer. Historians still debate whether this kind of spiritual geometry belonged more to mysticism than orthodoxy. But in this place, in this moment, those lines have blurred, and not just on the ground. You overhear a visiting friar whisper, "I dreamed of this place before I came." Another nods solemnly and adds, "I think the floor dreams back." You begin to believe it, and late one night, as the abbey sleeps and the stars burn sharp above the cloister, you stand alone in the center of Alaric's largest spiral. The chalk is faint now, weathered by wind and time, but your feet still feel the shape. And suddenly, for one heartbeat, you are still. You don't think. Don't pray. Don't analyze. You are. And in that silence, you finally understand what he's been trying to map all along. It wasn't heaven above. It was the doorway inside. By now it feels like the abbey lives inside one of Alaric's diagrams. Patterns stretch across every courtyard, every hall, every cloister walk. Some have been worn down by footsteps and wind, others freshly redrawn before dawn. The air itself hums with a quiet geometry, as if every breath has to pass through some invisible grid before entering your lungs. And then, the letters begin. Official ones, stamped with wax, dusted with road grit, carried by messengers who don't stay to answer questions. The abbot receives them silently, reads them behind closed doors, and burns them one by one. But everyone knows what they are. Inquiries, inspections, warnings. Because what's happening at this abbey has become too visible, too strange, too beautiful, too dangerous. A church representative arrives shortly after. Not a bishop, a deacon, which somehow feels worse. He's quiet, neatly dressed, carries no cross, no sword, just a small leather journal and a face that could be carved from stone. He walks the abbey grounds for 3 days, says little, watches everything. He doesn't speak to Alaric until the end of the 3rd day. And when he does, it's beneath the arched chapel gate, just as the morning sun strikes the east-facing rose design Alaric traced with honey and ash. The deacon says, "Brother, what is this?" Alaric doesn't hesitate. It's a map. To what he just smiles. To where we already are. That answer does not go over well. The following morning, a decree is read aloud in the refectory. All unauthorized symbols and geometric patterns are to be erased. Public drawing is suspended. Visitors are no longer welcome without written approval. And Brother Alaric is to cease all devotional diagramming until further notice. He listens. He bows. And then he walks to the center of the cloister and begins drawing with his feet, heel to toe in slow, deliberate steps. He outlines a spiral with nothing but movement tracing air where chalk once lived. Some monks pretend not to see him. Others stop to watch. A few close their eyes. You stand by the wall and feel your own heart beating in time with his steps. He doesn't speak, doesn't argue, just moves. Mainstream historical fact, the The church did maintain control over monastic teachings and expressions, especially anything resembling mystical or esoteric knowledge. It wasn't always enforced harshly, but it was watched closely, especially if the ideas began to spread. And Alaric's ideas, they're starting to echo. Visitors now return under false pretenses, as traveling scholars, as suppliers, even as distant cousins of nearby nobles. They don't stay long, just enough to walk one pattern, ask one question, kneel at one chalk circle before slipping back into the world. And the deacon watches it all. His journal fills. He begins following Alaric at a distance, noting every motion, every line, every word. You catch him once, tracing one of the older diagrams with a stick carefully, almost reverently, before shaking his head and scribbling something angrily in his notes. The pressure tightens. The abbot is summoned to a regional synod. Rumors fly that Alaric's practices are being classified as heretical, that the monastery might lose its charter, that some say the abbey has become a place of unauthorized pilgrimage. The words are sharp, but the lines remain, because here's the quiet truth: no one can unsee them. Once you've walked a pattern, once you've sat at the center and let the geometry whisper back to you, something changes. You start noticing the curve of the moon through the oculus, the way shadows fall perfectly along the cloister path at noon, the hum beneath the silence. And that's what scares them. Quirky detail. One afternoon you find Alaric humming as he grinds up crushed beetles to make a deep red pigment. You ask him what it's for. He grins and says, "For the diagrams no one sees." And sure enough, the next day you notice a faint red curve along the bottom edge of the garden wall, hidden in the vine shade. Impossible to notice unless you already knew to look. Historians still argue whether such monks were protectors of lost wisdom or inventors of modern myth. But you start to realize maybe they weren't trying to hide knowledge. Maybe they were teaching people how to look. Late one night, the deacon corners Alaric. Voices raise, not in anger, but in something closer to desperation. You catch only fragments: unorthodox practice, illusion of revelation, dangerous mimicry. Alaric doesn't flinch, just replies softly, "The pattern doesn't come from me. I only remember it." The next morning, the deacon is gone, left nothing but a single note tacked to the chapel door. Not heresy, but not safe. And now a strange calm settles in. Not silence, but stillness. The kind that happens after a storm has passed, but the trees are still dripping. Alaric no longer draws in the open, but somehow the patterns continue. In the arrangement of books left on the library table, in the way firewood stacks near the hearth, in the layout of the herb garden's paths. Subtle, persistent, like the abbey itself has started drawing. You realize something else? Even you have changed. You pace more deliberately, sit in places where the sun lingers longer, stack your parchment in layers that feel correct, though you don't know why. You hum without meaning to, trace spirals with your finger on rough stone. You're not following Alaric anymore. You're following the pattern, and maybe, just maybe, it's following you back. You begin to dream in circles, not metaphorically. Literal spirals. Loops of gold threads of ink, winding staircases made of light. You wake with the impression that your mind has walked through something far older than your thoughts. Sometimes the dreams are silent. Sometimes they hum. You find Alaric again, of course you do. He's in the old crypt, where monks go only for solemn anniversaries and dust-thick remembrance. But he's not praying. He's mapping. Tiny lines drawn with coal on the inner sides of the archways. Circles around burial niches. A narrow line that connects one tomb to another in a perfect diagonal. You recognize the names. Some of the abbey's earliest abbots, long since reduced to memory and brittle teeth. Alaric points to one of the curves and says, "They were dreamers too." You don't ask how he knows. He carries no tools now. No chalk, no string, no clever compass fashioned from candle stubs. Just his hands, his eyes, and that steady voice like a bell rung underwater. He tells you this: the final pattern isn't drawn, it's walked. So you walk. He leads you not in a line, but in a dance. Through the old cloister, through the garden, past the now empty visitor quarters, and down into the scriptoria, where no one copies anything anymore. Each turn seems aimless until you notice it's not. You're moving in widening arcs, circling a center you didn't know was there. And at the very heart, an unmarked stone, round, flat, worn smooth with time and footsteps. He kneels, presses his palm to it, and breathes. You sit beside him silent, and in that quiet, something inside you unknots. You realize this isn't performance, it's not resistance, it's remembrance. Mainstream fact, many medieval monasteries were built atop older sacred sites, pagan groves, Roman ruins, ancient wells. The stones themselves carry memory. Architecture becomes archaeology. Faith builds on faith. Alaric calls them echoes. You don't start the pattern, he tells you. You continue it. A few monks join you that evening. Quietly. No questions, no chalk, just footsteps. One leaves a flower on the central stone. Another hums. And someone begins marking time with a gentle clap, like a heartbeat made into sound. You remember a passage from an old text, one Alaric once underlined 3 times. There is a silence beneath the silence, and there God dreams. You don't know what it means, but you feel it now. The abbot returns from his second summons, looking paler, older. He doesn't speak during meals, spends long hours walking the perimeter of the abbey. Once you see him staring at the cloister wall, eyes tracking something only he can see. Later he calls you into his study. He says, "You've walked the circles too." You nod. He sighs, rubs his forehead. Then very softly, "They'll be coming." You don't need to ask who. A decision has been made. Some authority somewhere beyond walls and parchments has decided that what's happening here isn't aligned with ecclesiastical clarity. Translation too strange, too quiet, too powerful. You ask what he'll do. He smiles a tired, genuine thing. "I've walked the pattern. Let them try to erase it. And here's the miracle. No one panics. Not Alaric, not the monks, not even the birds. Instead, you begin to prepare, not to fight, to remember." Alaric teaches the younger brothers how to fold diagrams into their prayers, how to build patterns into garden rows, how to sing the hours with tones that reflect sun positions. It's not rebellion, it's preservation. Quirky detail. He starts carving symbols into seeds, literally. Tiny circles etched into pumpkin seeds, bean casings, apple pips. You ask him why. He says, "Because even the soil forgets." The last week passes like the end of a season. You trace and retrace the diagrams in your mind until they appear even with your eyes closed. You walk the spiral one more time. Sit at the rose-shaped junction near the gate and watch the light fall exactly where Alaric once said it would. Historians still argue whether Alaric was ever officially condemned. The records are missing. The dates fuzzy. Some claim the abbey fell into disrepair. Others insist it became a secret haven for pilgrims long after its name was erased from church rolls. But you remember. The night before the arrival, Alaric comes to your cell. He doesn't knock, doesn't speak, just holds out a bundle wrapped in linen. Inside, 3 parchments, a flat stone with a spiral and a pouch of seeds. He nods, once then turns and disappears down the corridor, like mist unraveling from stone. The next morning they come, clerics in crimson robes, soldiers with polished boots, A scribe already writing as he walks. They demand names, burn scrolls, mark diagrams for destruction. But they don't see everything. They don't notice the chalk etched beneath benches, the diagrams in seed rows, the symmetry in the garden paths, the stories carried by memory. Because Alaric is already gone, and the pattern remains. You leave the abbey before sunrise, not because you're afraid, not because you were told, but because the path has changed and something in you says it's time to walk it. You slip through the garden gate as the eastern sky begins to fade from ink to pewter. Behind you, the abbey is still a single breath held in stone. In your satchel, the parchments, the stone, the seeds. In your heart, a spiral. You follow no road, not exactly. Instead, you follow light, shadows, the angles of tree trunks, and the shape of rivers. Everything seems to echo something Alaric once drew. You pass through villages, towns, forests that feel like half-forgotten cathedrals. People stop you sometimes, ask questions they can't quite name, and you answer them the only way you know how, with a circle, a prayer in silence. You never say his name, but you leave his shapes behind. A chalk spiral on a barn wall, a row of cabbages planted in the form of a labyrinth, a window cut so the solstice light falls directly on a stone marked with 3 dots. You become part of the pattern. Mainstream fact: after the medieval period, there were entire movements, quiet, obscure, dedicated to divine measurement, the grammar of space, the sacred compass. You find their fingerprints centuries later in Masonic diagrams, Gothic rows, windows, garden mazes, even strange architectural alignments whispered about in dusty books. Alaric's name is never mentioned, but his language, it echoes. You meet others, not many, just enough. A builder who aligns doorways to starlight, a woman who sings only in intervals of fifths and swears the songs heal roots, a child who draws circles in her porridge before eating. You recognize them instantly, not by face, but by the way they walk, a half step behind the world, listening. You show them the parchment sometimes, the spiral stone, the seed marked with the tiniest perfect triangle. Most of them don't ask what it means. They just nod and begin to draw. You settle nowhere for long, but you leave places more whole than you found them. A broken wall mended along lines of golden ratio, a chapel with a spiral garden out front, a vineyard laid out like a sleeping star. And one day, you reach the sea. There's no map for this, just the sound of water and the smell of salt, and the way the gulls seem to trace invisible chords in the sky. You walk the sand and find a smooth shell in the shape of a spiral. You hold it in your hand and something clicks. Not in your mind, in the world, as if something has found its place. You sit at the edge of the water and draw the last diagram in the sand. A single line, curving, unfinished. You press the stone into the center, scatter the seeds around it, and wait. That night you dream of a tower made of circles, of stars that hum, of a voice that isn't a voice saying, "You are not lost, you're turning." You wake with tears and laughter, not knowing which came first. The path has no end, only rhythms and Alaric. You never see him again, but sometimes when the wind is just right and the angle of light slices perfectly through the branches, you hear a whisper under your breath. The pattern remembers, and in that moment, you do too. Now slow your breathing just a little. Let the air settle around you, warm and soft, like the still hush of a cloister garden at dawn. The spirals are fading now, not erased, just absorbed, folding into your thoughts like quiet waves on a shore made of memory and dream. The path you walked tonight, it isn't made of stone or chalk. It's made of attention, stillness, The subtle sacred geometry of simply being where you are. And just like Alaric, you don't need a map to remember. You already carry it in the turn of your breath, in the shape of your thoughts, in the quiet echo between heartbeats. Whatever the day holds ahead, whatever questions rise like mist from the lake, you can return to this spiral. Just a finger drawn in dust, a soft chant in your mind, a memory of a monk with chalk-stained sleeves and a whisper that tilted the stars. Because some stories aren't told to be finished, they're told to keep turning. So drift now. Let the circles loosen. Let the patterns pause. We've walked far tonight. And you've done beautifully. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Maybe by now you've already drifted off to sleep, and if so, we hope this story brought you peace of mind and helped you rest a little easier. Until next time, sweet dreams.